We are back in the black hole of real estate, and we are going to spend some time today talking about buying a home versus renting a home, and some of the things that I've noticed are changing just a little bit in this marketplace. This is your host, Ron Wojciechowski, for the black hole of real estate, and we're finding that the past several years, it was much, much more cost effective to own a property as opposed to renting a property. And while that still holds true, the gap is narrowing to an extent. But the reasons that people are renting as opposed to buying do make sense in a lot of cases. Yeah, more often than you might think. There is this feeling for many people that it's always better to own than rent because you're throwing your money away, is something we've been taught all throughout our real estate background, and even growing up, a lot of us, you want to own your own home versus rent your home. But there are times that it makes sense to rent. If your income and your credit and your down payment are such that your mortgage application will not get you the best possible rate, and in fact might have a little higher rate, then the cost of ownership could be prohibitive, and it might actually be the same or even more than renting. And then when you think about potential repairs or yard work that you have to do, equipment you have to buy, household maintenance, that could also be something that would stop you. If the homes in your price point might need a roof or an air conditioning unit, if he's looked into those, a roof that was 10 might be 15 or 20,000 right now, and the HVAC systems that were $4 or $5 grand are now 8 and 10. So for a renter that now buys a home, an out-of-pocket expense, and let's just suppose that the roof is a new and HVAC, just those two things aren't new, that could be $20,000 or $30,000 out of pocket. Now, there might be financing available, but if your mortgage is starting to max you out a little bit, or it's similar to what you're renting for, you're adding in these other payments, it could make a really, really difficult time early on. So as a renter, if you've got a suitable down payment and good credit, you could absolutely look at purchasing. And it might make sense. It might even make sense if it costs a little bit more to own the house, but as you pay down the mortgage, you're building equity. You have your own home. You may get some write-offs for home ownership. There are some benefits to it. But the gap is narrowing. And the stigma, has long since gone away. Oh, you rent? I can speak from personal experience, that when I was in the restaurant and hospitality business, I spent what seemed like all day, every day there. In reality, I probably had like Wednesday night off and worked 18 hours on the other days a lot of times. So my requirements for a home were different than if I worked a 9 to 5-er, Monday through Friday. The fact is, what I needed was a crash pad at a place, just keeps a few things. But if I was always at work, the last thing I wanted to do when I finally got home was like yard work and maintenance and upkeep. So when the landlord would take care of that, or at least I could ask them to take care of it, then that was a benefit, for me. So for me, the renting made way more sense just from a time constraint. I didn't want to come home and have to do those things. I wanted to pay a rent check, live at a place. It was nice, neat, clean. It was there. It was consistent for me. It satisfied what I needed at the time, which was just a place to keep my stuff and sleep occasionally. That was all I needed it for. So from a time perspective, that made a lot of sense. And if you start to bundle in the services that would cost me to, if I had to repaint the house or take care of the roof or, pave the driveway or, take care of the yard work or the trees or the landscape, all those things, time and money, it was more cost effective for me and better just to rent for a while. Now I can tell you that, owning the home that we live in, that I thoroughly enjoy that. We could do so many more things to it, and it's ours, and we can make it our own, and that's super exciting and compelling. But as I look at this, if we're going to talk about buying versus renting, I do believe the conversation for many people in this situation starts with a renter who's has a vision of eventually owning a home. So in that time, if you were to think of what the home would cost you and you're currently renting, and if your rent was $2,000 a month and you were thinking, well, I could own it for 18 and save 200, I might go the other direction and say, well, all right, you're paying 2,000 right now. Could you be putting, you pay your 2,000 rent, but could you also, put $200 in savings a month? Because at the end of the year, be 2-3 grand sitting there, and that might really help you when it comes time to make the purchase as far as down payment or closing costs. But it also conditions you, to make that payment. And I realize that the payment might be less, but if you were to factor in a couple hundred extra dollars for maintenance or upkeep or renovations, or maybe you want to do something for the house or put in a patio, or get yourself a summer kitchen or a grill or buy a lawnmower. I mean, any of those things. If you're preconditioned to a payment that's a little bit higher, then that might help you as the expenses come in or the upgrades and improvements come in. Now, if you are renting, I think the tips that we would give you would be more of a how do I qualify for a home podcast, which we're going to do again. But saving for a down payment and closing costs, perfect. Keeping your credit nice, limiting your inquiries, not applying for every credit card over the holidays to save 10% at the checkout. I think those are things that we know and we should be doing. Not missing a payment on your rental, so that way it can work towards the history of payment. When it comes to housing, that will help your application. Those are some of the things we look at and should be paid attention to. But those are the big things. If you're renting, and it's comfortable in the ways that I mentioned, that's great. Now, let's flip it over. If you're renting, what are the benefits of home ownership? Well, number one, you get to pick any paint color that you want. And you could do anything with the yard that you want to do, unless there's a homeowners association that says that you can't do something. But, that's a whole other conversation. You can get some tax write-offs, build equity. And if you own the home and eventually choose to move on, you can actually make it your first investment property, going from owning it and living in it to owning it and renting it out. And you can flip the switch and you can be the one collecting the rent. And any surplus rent comes in every month you can use towards your next house payment, if it's a little bit more, or you can work in such a way that it can help you buy another investment property. So there's a couple of things going on that you can do with that. I think all of which are pretty exciting as a step between where you are and where you might want to be. As far as the interest rates, again, a different conversation, but you could overcome that with interest rate buy downs. They call it a 2-1 buy down. You could also refinance down the road, and some lending companies will help you pay for that. Some will actually waive the lender costs on the refinance for a number of years. The other thing that we can talk about that isn't often talked about is accidental landlord. And let's just suppose that you own a home, you've already bought it, but now you have to move for some reason. Maybe it's a change in family status, adding a member or changing a member, being married, not being married, blended families, those things. You may be moving from where you live, where you own, and renting it out. And in some cases, and I went through this, I actually had a couple of properties one I lived in and one I rented out, and I moved into a rental, and get this, I took the rents from the 2 houses I owned, and I used that to pay for my rental. So go figure. I know it's a little bit backwards, but you could actually have a couple of rentals that maybe are not in an area or location close to work or family or things that you do, rent those places out, and then you can use that to pay for a property that you just rent from somebody else. But an accidental landlord, as I was talking to just a second ago, that's someone who has a change in status or a change in job or relocation that for a certain amount of time, not wanting to sell the house because maybe they've got a year or two contract, a couple hours away. They might rent a space in that area so they're not commuting so much, but then have someone else rent their home for a couple of years, and then when their contract is done or the job is done, come back and go back into their own home. So you could be an accidental landlord and choose to rent your property out for a while and then move back into it, or just an accidental landlord due to a change in your status and rent it out long term. And it could just be that you're cashing out of a house and maybe you're selling it today and you have no real plans of where you want to go next. And let's just suppose for a minute that you're sitting on a lot of equity, and maybe you want to take time off from work or travel and you sell your house. Then maybe you're finding, put your stuff in storage or a lot of it and get a small place, maybe an efficiency where just a place to keep some things on and a TV and some internet and a place to go when you're not traveling or doing other things. So, selling your home and then renting a smaller place, so that works too. So, there's a lot of combinations in this scenario. And it could absolutely make sense to rent. It could absolutely make sense to buy. And I think it just depends on what's right for you in this, part of the journey of your life. And it could change. And I can personally tell you that I've rented and owned multiple times on each side of the equation of my life, and it all made sense at the time. And I think it would for you. So I hope that this sheds a little bit of light on buying versus renting. And if you have questions, then watch for a future podcast about qualifying for a home and first-time home buyers and how do I, break free from renting and get into buying. Those things we can absolutely talk about. Right now, I want to give a baseline of what the differences are between buying and renting. Hope you enjoyed this show. This is Ron Wysokarski for the Black Hole of Real Estate.